In this video, I will possibly shock, amaze, and stupefy those who have seen my previous videos related to Islam, which elicited violent threats from many Muslims. A couple weeks ago, Pat Kendall made a video opposing the proposed $100 million mosque near Ground Zero in New York City. While not explicit about the means he recommended to stop the building, he invoked a vague formula of public opinion and politicians, which I take as a call for the government to violate the property rights of the owners. Condell is European, so invoking collectivism and majority opinion against individual rights is within their decadent cultural norms. However, in America, we still have some respect for due process and property rights despite democratic redistributionism and Republican pragmatism. As evidence of this retained American value, see the public reaction to the Kelo decision. Therefore, I was surprised when some of my friends began a heated exchange on whether, in effect, this mosque construction should be blocked by any means necessary, including an illegitimate use of government power. As an aside, for those who did not follow my humor, by any means necessary invokes a famous phrase from militant American Muslim Malcolm X, who was assassinated by his Muslim brothers. For the benefit of those who tingle with anticipation about my conclusions and do not want to be bothered with actually considering the ideas, I will summarize briefly. I think that 1. It is valid to raise the question about whether this should be allowed. 2. It is valid to be personally opposed to the construction just as it is to be opposed to anchovies on pizza. And 3. In the full context, it is unjust to use government force to violate these owners' property rights. As I have more outrageous, as in contrary to common opinion, statements to follow, you might want to listen to this whole video, as there may be other points that you will want to comment upon incoherently. The following is adapted from 2 separate comments that I made in separate threads, where the first was dominated by those asserting the defense of property rights in this case, and the second by those for violating those rights in the face of the Muslim threat. I agree regarding the protection of individual rights in the U.S. of Muslims, including property rights. I agree that conservatives have failed to articulate a reasonable case for their political actions related to this mosque. I agree that failed and evasive national policies related to protecting American citizens and interests from terrorism foster more failed domestic policies as an ineffectual alternative. In context, I think that the questions about affiliation with terrorism are substantial and merit greater focus. To illustrate this point, I will cite a couple specific similar cases that have had time to play out. Several years ago, the Saudis planned to relocate their Islamic school in the D.C. suburbs to a location close to the international airport, from which 9/11 hijackers were later to depart. At the time, a local Christian megachurch led a successful effort to block the Saudi plan, and I advocated at the time to defend the Muslims' property rights to build without local government interference. Subsequently, terrorists have been tied to that specific school, which continued at its previous location, including a valedictorian convicted of a plot to assassinate an incumbent U.S. president. Congressional allegations that instructional material at the school fosters terrorism have been made without resolution. The largest mosque in our area, Dar Al-Hijrah, had direct links to 9/11 hijackers, the Fort Hood shooter, and was previously led by Anwar al-Awlaki, marked for death by President Obama for his association with Al-Qaeda, 9/11, Fort Hood, and the failed Detroit underwear bomber. Despite its ties to terrorism, the U.S. Census Bureau has paid that mosque $500,000 to rent space, raising questions in my mind about religious tax exemptions being used for commercial advantage and to fund terrorism. Further, the mosque has close ties to the local Democratic Party, whose leaders have actively engaged in fundraising for the mosque, including a leading member of a House terrorism subcommittee. Unfortunately, my area is rife with Islamists, arrests for terrorist financing, Al-Qaeda associates, and with targets hit by terrorists including Langley. This was openly evident in the death threats received by Dr. John Lewis, author of Nothing Less Than Victory, when he spoke at a local university a few years ago. But privately, when a Muslim biology doctoral candidate at the same school was approached at a local mosque by Islamists to join their cause and potentially bring his brain to their weapons development programs. It has been stated several times, and not challenged in this thread, that Islam is at war with us, whether we recognize it or not. However, to be accurate, the Ummah is at war within itself, with different factions attempting to use us for their own political advantage. Within our nominal allies, those in power seek our support to maintain their political authority, and those out of power cite our support to their enemies as the cause of their failure to achieve local victory. And the converse is true of states who are our enemies. This is not to discount duplicity and multiple intentions within our nominal allies. For example, U.S. basing rights in small Gulf states are for them also a check against both Saudi and Iranian expansionism, as the British had been previously in the region. Al-Qaeda had attacked us to disperse our power so that targeted local regimes, especially Saudi Arabia, were weakened in their domestic legitimacy and in our material support for them. For example, with 9/11, mostly Saudi hijackers were selected specifically to weaken our alliance with the House of Saud, and our political response has misallocated resources and focus to homeland security. Islam is vile, evil, wrong, etc. However, Islam should not be made more important in this conflict than it actually is. Islamism, Sayyid Qutb, is the flavor du jour for political violence in the Middle East, and was preceded by other collectivist ideologies, pan-Arab, Marxist, nationalist, tribalist. Just as with Nasserism, defeating the Islamists will not be sufficient to end the violence or the threat, as a different collectivist ideology or nihilism will simply replace it as the justification for initiating force to achieve political goals. As a reminder of shifting ideological justifications, the Palestinian assassin of Robert Kennedy was a Christian, not a Muslim. To the extent that this is a clash of civilizations, it is not one between Islam and the West, but between collectivist barbarism and modernity, arising from globalization, and reflected in similar conflicts elsewhere in the world. See Latin America. In response to the allegations related to terrorism and the owners of this building, to summarize the evidence presented, despite our government's continuous vigilance in thwarting domestic terrorism and international terrorist financing, there are no relevant indictments nor convictions, which should be readily available from public records. In the future, if for no other reason than it becoming a magnet for Islamists, this New York City mosque location will probably be associated with terrorism, even if its current leadership does not have such overt ties or intent. Many of our political leaders will advance and protect the mosque, even if it does become a base for terrorist financing, recruitment, basing, and proselytizing, as has occurred with Dar al-Hijrah outside of D.C. However, absent evidence and due process, the government should not preemptively prevent them from turning this building into a criminal enterprise. Using admittedly illegitimate government force to prevent the construction of this money pit, mosque, at this specific location does nothing to actually stop terrorism, as they could construct the same or multiple installations at other locations. Absent a ubiquitous ban on mosques, the principal issue advanced against this specific location is based upon the primacy of consciousness. They will think they are winning. If they should make that mistake, it is our own fault for failing to instantiate their defeat in the realm of existence. There's nothing to be actually gained in fighting terrorism by the city government blocking this particular mosque at this particular site. Further, using illegitimate means to block it risks not only fundamental American rights, but also undercuts actual counterterrorism efforts.